Hey folks, welcome to this special live stream edition of the DarkHorse podcast. I am here with Dr. Heather Hying, who was, I kid you not, Evergreen's most popular professor, and for very good reason. We are going to talk today about what took place at Evergreen, both before and after the protests that turned so quickly into riots. This is an anniversary for us. It's the third anniversary of the day that 50 students I had never met showed up at my classroom accusing me of racism and demanding that I either resign or be fired. I refused, and things descended from there into certainly chaos, and I would argue anarchy, which was in fact the plan of many of the protesters. All right, where shall we begin?
I think you wanted to start before we talked a little bit about what Evergreen had been in its past and how it was founded, about the spectacular and public nature of the collapse. Just start there. That's what you had said to me.
Yeah. The problem for us is that we were, for reasons that will surely come up in our discussion here, we were fully ensconced in a life in Olympia, Washington, and our teaching lives were the core of it. So we spent 14 years in my case, 15 years in yours, teaching in an environment that freed us to do remarkable things. When the collapse happened and suddenly the existence of Evergreen was on many people's minds who didn't know anything about it beforehand, and our roles there was suddenly front and center, it gave people an impression of the place, and inevitably that impression would be misleading. It couldn't help it because, at best it was a vignette, and it was a vignette at a moment that things were very abnormal. But it has been kind of a struggle since the thing occurred to try to correct the record so that people, we don't want it to be recorded in people's minds as a cartoon. We want it to be recorded as the actual descent into madness that it was, but descent from what? That's really the tough part. The public nature of the descent overwrote the true nature of what was actually going on there, which wasn't all good, but nonetheless, there was nuance.
Yeah, some, particularly on the political right, would argue that this was the inevitable end of any place that had broken so many of the rules of the status quo model of higher ed as Evergreen did. And we have and will continue to push back quite firmly on that. This didn't have to happen. Certainly, Evergreen ended up being gameable, and thus, as anything that is gameable will happen, it got gamed. But there was nothing about the original nature of the school and its attempt to get rid of some of the top-down, generic, sit in rows and ask questions, speak only when spoken to, sort of model of higher ed, that Evergreen was resisting and had broken, that inherently led to this. And in fact, it's some of the evidence for that is that none of our students, and indeed none of the students of the handful of other faculty there who were doing, and I'm sure there were more than a handful, but it wasn't everyone by any means. There were a handful of other faculty there whom we were close with. None of our students and none of their students were part of this madness. They were there trying to engage their brains, their bodies, their minds in a pursuit of truth, beauty, compassion, any number of things. But they were not invested in or participating in the madness.
Yeah, in fact, the thing that occurred to me this morning as I was reflecting on the anniversary was that at some level, Evergreen, where it worked, was an attempt to instantiate the sort of Star Trek model of getting along, where basically one puts aside the superficial stuff and you team up for some sort of a larger goal. And so the aspect of the college that worked really did manage to look past people's superficial characteristics and to very good effect.
Okay, so it seems like we're kind of going someplace where I thought you wanted to start with something spectacular, talking about what the madness looked like. We're going to get there, but as long as we're doing this, let's say we want this to be amusing and cathartic and something that actually gets us someplace new. But let's just can I just go into
Please.
what I had thought about us doing second, since we're sort of easing into it anyway. So I'm just going to talk a little bit to begin about what the mission of the college was, and in particular a nearly founding faculty who died last month, who was of particular note, and I think he really epitomized what Evergreen could be. Okay, so Evergreen was founded by visionaries and innovators, by people who in the late 1960s saw the status quo in higher ed as too as too rigid and not nimble enough, not interactive enough for the times or for the future that they imagined was coming. The founding faculty were an eclectic bunch, and you taught with a few of them, actually. And we were at Evergreen starting in 2002 and 2003, respectively, for the tail end of the tenure of the founding faculty. Just a few of them remained at the point that we showed up at that point. You taught with Tom Rainey and David Milne, and I think that was it in terms of the founding faculty whom you talked with. And the faculty who weren't quite founding but got there really early included Steve Herman, who died last month. And Steve was a great man. He was a great educator and naturalist, a great mentor and a friend. He was also an ornithologist, and God, did he know birds. I've never met anyone else who knew birds as well as he did, although his students caught up to him worked to catch up with him. His students adored him. His colleagues did not. And I think that was telling.
If I can interject one thing. So students very frequently bounced between your programs and my programs and into the programs that we taught together.
Yeah.
In general, the best of our students during the summer would go off and they would take summer ornithology with Steve. So although I barely knew him, he was like the third member of the team in some ways, because what they learned from us on campus during the year, they then put into practice in the field with birds. And so anyway, he was a very important figure in our community.
That's right. And apparently, I didn't know this, but in looking back through some old emails in the last few days, I found that he actually used to talk about running his own separate college within Evergreen, as we did as well,
Yep.
Right? He not only did he know birds, he knew it was possible at Evergreen and in the natural world and in the hearts and minds of students and in so much else too. So I was told that the position that I was hired to in a common tradition in academia was to replace someone, and that someone in my case was Steve. And it was clearly impossible to actually replace him, but I was his academic sort of doppelganger.
You replaced him in the daytime curriculum. He continued to teach summer ornithology.
That's right.
Throughout the period that we were there.
That's right. So I was told by many faculty at Evergreen during my tenure there that Steve was quarrelsome and a curmudgeon and cantankerous and not worth engaging with. And I was then very grateful to become friends with him quickly. Once I was even told by a faculty colleague, when I was being a thorn in this person's side, that I was just like Steve Herman. And I smiled and gave thanks for the unintended compliment, which further irked this guy, I think you were in the room when this happened. Steve Herman appreciated honest and honorable feedback. He craved it. And not many people gave it to him because they found him scary, and they thought that it had to be his way or the highway, but in fact it was quite the opposite. He had no patience, though, for complacency, for sycophancy, for cowardice, or for laziness. He had no patience for these things, and he gave people the truth whether they wanted to hear it or not. And this is, of course, a big part of why he had a reputation for being cantankerous, because people didn't always like what he had to say to them. He was kind and wonderful and honorable, but he did not suffer fools lightly.
I was just going to say he did not suffer administrators lightly.
Well, and this is, so I did have a line here. He was not cantankerous, despite what some of his former colleagues have claimed. What he was totally intolerant of bullshit. He had courage, wit and humor, depth of reason and compassion, and love for all forms of life, except perhaps for cowards and soulless bureaucrats, for which he had no love and no patience. So just two more things about Steve before we use this to embark on talking about what Evergreen was more broadly. One of my favorite memories of Steve is from sitting around a campfire, as so many deep and meaningful memories are, especially from Evergreen. It was 2012, and he and I were at Navapatia, a field station in Sonora, Mexico, on the Sea of Cortez. Steve had first taken students to this magical place. It was land and water together, birds and mangroves and cactus, 10 years earlier. And in the interim, his daughter and son-in-law, Sally and Adam, had turned it into a small, rustic, beautiful field station. And every year, every spring, I guess it was every winter quarter, Steve got some number of students, something between 4 and 10, to do field work down at Navapatia. And this year I was sponsoring the contracts of those students, and I was able to go down there for 10 days. And I was visiting the students whose work I was overseeing and experiencing firsthand this place that I had heard so much about, both from Steve and to some degree from Sally and Adam, who I didn't know well at that point, but also from the generations of students before. Steve had driven down with a friend, and Steve was already old. He was already retired, but he had driven down near the border of Sonora and Sinaloa in Mexico. And one night, after a full day of field work that we all engaged in, under a nearly full moon, all of us sat around a campfire on this thin strip of shoreline on the Sea of Cortez and passed around a bottle of lecheguilla, which is the local agave liquor, and played guitar. Steve did, as well as a few of the students, and told stories. And Steve's stories were always full of humor and bashing of those who needed bashing, and honor for those who deserved honor. Tales of birds and people, mostly, and just stunning. So then, in early 2017, when Evergreen was blowing up, Steve and I had an interaction online about the vandalism that had taken place at the Natural History Museum. Because one of the things that happened during the protests that turned into riots at Evergreen was that some of the activists went after not all of campus, but specifically the science buildings and the library. And a number of windows were smashed at the Natural History Museum and in the science labs. And other vandalism happened at the library and also at the newly named Les Perce Hall, named for the former president, who was an excellent president of the college. So he and I were going back and forth talking about what to do and how it wasn't actually even safe to go onto campus to do the cleanup, but that the specimens in the collections were at risk. And he said, with regard to the anarchy on campus, quote, "I too am in disbelief. I've made some minor efforts to find colleagues to join me in supporting Bret. Silence is the usual result, but some express support but want to keep it secret. Who would have thought we at Evergreen were a mob?"
Yeah, this is such an important part of the story of what happened. And actually, it points rather exactly to what I think one of the major themes and lessons of the entire thing was for me and for us, which is that crisis reveals people's character for both better and worse.
Yes.
And we saw spectacular examples of both. Now,
Yes, we did.
I will say we saw much less of it, much less courage amongst the faculty than I would have hoped.
And expected.
Hoped and expected. People
Yeah.
that we would have counted as friends were absolutely silent. And,
Or worse.
Or worse. Yeah, some of them were far worse. And that's a very troubling thing to discover. Amongst the faculty, the ones who did stand up, some very surprising people came to our aid, but almost all of them retired.
Yeah, they were almost all emeritus, which means that the college had no grasp on them anymore.
Well, it did, but it also meant that they came from an era in which the college was really about something much more substantive. And anyway, I know I got told, and I think you got told, that we were like founding faculty members in the wrong generation frequently, which, I take to have been a compliment. But anyway, the thing is, current faculty did not show up. A few of them did, a very, very tiny number.
Mike Paros in particular
Paros
is the one whose name most people will know if they know any of them, but there were a few others.
There were a few.
And some of the academic staff as well, and some of the non-academic staff.
Staff were more likely to stand up, even though they were far less safe than the tenured faculty.
Yep.
And then the people who shined the brightest were students.
Oh, 100%. A huge fraction of our students, and I mean, really a majority of our students we heard from and were actively trying to fight this thing. And We've, of course, heard from many other students, and many of you will be familiar with Benjamin Boyce, who we came to know in the aftermath of this. And he has done stunning work documenting what happened in the year or two leading up to it and what happened afterwards. And that points to the student body that actually did exist at Evergreen. That Evergreen has gotten mocked, for instance, for having an acceptance policy that was like 99%, often 98, 99%. And it always felt to us like this actually was a positive thing. That no, this was not a selective college. It wasn't a highly selective college or even really a selective college by most measures. But what it allowed, and sure, there were people who came through the door that were not capable of actually doing any kind of work that was useful. And for the most part, we didn't see those because over in the sciences, students who really were not interested in doing any work or capable didn't even show up. But we had so many students who had been failed by school. And they were many of them were told that they had failed school, but I will say no, they were failed by school. And some of them came into our classroom saying, I know I'm dumb because I've been told I'm dumb all my life by teachers. And not a single student who ever came to me and said that was dumb or incapable or lazy or incoherent or incapable of developing deep critical thinking on issues evolutionary and beyond.
So I want to, there are a lot of things wrapped up in what you just said, and I want to highlight a few of them.
Yeah.
One thing is the lack of selectivity of the college produced two populations inside the college, and the two populations have everything to do with what unfolded.
Yeah.
So you had people who showed up there because it was the college of last resort. They could get in, they couldn't get in somewhere else, and many of them, largely through no fault of their own, through the failure of the schools that they had come from, didn't have the skills to do the work. And then there was a large population of misfits and oddballs and unusual people just who didn't have a taste for the elite colleges. And we saw them all. And because, it's a strange thing to say, but because you and I were both very, very popular, our classes overflowed. There were more.
We never didn't have a wait list.
Never
Even
didn't.
with enrolment, when nearly everyone else was having a hard time filling classes, we had wait lists.
And what this meant, oddly, we weren't, in most cases, except in the rare case of study abroad, in most cases, we were not allowed to decide who came into our classes. But there was a backdoor mechanism, and we used it. So there was this tradition before any term began. There's a thing called academic fair, in which you could sit down with any professor you wanted to and talk to them about the program they were teaching. And
this is before registration happened. So
Yeah.
this is a way for students to, I hate the consumer metaphor here, but shop for the full-time program that they would be taking for a quarter or 2 quarters or 3 quarters. And this was a month or so before registration, or a day before registration, a month or more before classes started.
So when students asked us for advice, we told them a lot of stuff. We would tell them whether the program they were considering taking was likely to be any good. But the key thing was it made all the difference in the world who was teaching. A good professor who was teaching something you maybe weren't that interested in would probably give you something of high value. A terrible professor who was teaching something that you were nominally interested in was very unlikely to teach you anything, and you were liable to feel, because these were full-time programs, you were liable to feel trapped. So anyway, the academic fair was like an opportunity to interview professors. But I also took it, and you took it, as an opportunity to interview students and figure out whether or not they were a good fit. And in my case in particular, often they weren't, because I wasn't a normal kind of professor. And so you sort of had to be ready for my deficits. And if you were prepared for them, there was a lot you could get out of it. But in any case, by discouraging students who wouldn't be a good fit for the program and encouraging those who would be a good fit. And in my case, I always let in a few extras, people who showed particular promise but didn't register in time or something, didn't make it into the class. I would let those in, and this would adjust the character of the room. The room would be really high quality, and my feeling was, as long as you had one person in the room who was willing to volley with you, you could teach the others to do it, and you could get a really great teaching environment up and running pretty quickly.
Absolutely.
So anyway, that created an opportunity for us to build a community of people who were super high caliber, even in a college that wasn't selective, right? We weren't allowed to be formally selective, but informally it happened. And this
We also, students would often show up from past programs and sit in on one or more many weeks of classes simply because they wanted to continue to be part of the conversation that we were having, the ongoing evolutionary conversation. And so having these basically alums of our programs in the room very often also raised the level of discussion in the room.
Oh, absolutely. They functioned like TAs, and they were there just because they were hungry to find the community that was still having the conversation that they had benefited from.
Yeah.
I, late in the game, found out that there was a proper term for this, which I borrowed from Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs, who famously dropped out of, was it Reed?
Yeah, I think
In any case, Steve Jobs dropped out of college, but he didn't stop going. Right. He kept going. He was trying to save his parents their tuition money, but he wasn't interested in not learning, and so he went and just took what he wanted. So he called himself a drop-in, right? And these students who came back to our programs became drop-ins. And in any case, it created a couple of things. One, it created a very delightful teaching environment for us, which I think made us a little bit less aware of just how bad things were descending into madness in the larger college. Because our community was healthy, the larger community's descent into madness was, I mean, we were aware of it, but I don't think we were as alarmed as we should have been, which meant that it, until the last year, it would have caught us off guard.
Although I do remember conversations, certainly between us and a few of our other colleagues, who were saying, the students remain amazing. What we can do with the curriculum and with education with this model is amazing. But when I come onto campus, I just keep my head down and go from my classroom to my office and home. And I don't want to, increasingly, we were finding over the last several years that our supposed peers were going off the rails.
Our supposed peers were going off the rails, going after each other, and the good ones were keeping their head down. Mm-hmm. Actually, maybe as long as we're here, can we look at some of those pictures from our...
Sure, you got these up. I don't know what you've got in store for us.
So let me just set this up a little bit.
Yep.
So Heather became excellent at creating study abroad programs at a price that was unheard of. And the price really shouldn't matter, except that what it meant was that a range of students could go on these study abroad programs who never would have been able to afford it at a normal college doing this at a normal rate.
The price was incredibly low.
It was incredibly low.
And I worked with them too. The students who were eligible for Pell Grants, I worked with them to get them some funds, basically scholarships, that over half of my students who applied every time I did study abroad got these, such that they actually went into debt very little for the experience of a 6, 8, 11-week study abroad in Panama or Ecuador.
Right. So these things were inexpensive, which meant they were more diverse than they would otherwise be. They were intensive. You got them help. You worked with them to be able to go. And they were also just much better than you would be able to source anywhere else. So the final one, the one I went on with you, and
that we did together, yes,
we did together, and I'm plenty good at showing up and teaching, but I was not responsible for making this happen. That was all Heather.
No, but it was a totally different experience. I mean, all of my study abroads were amazing and flawed and glorious, but this last one that we did together was the two of us, our 2 children, 30 students, 11 weeks in Ecuador.
Been with all year. So we had learned, so again, Evergreen classes are full-time, or at least they were. Full-time, which meant a professor teaches one class, students take one class, you're with each other full-time. It's your job.
Yeah.
And
so we'd already been in the field with them in the Pacific Northwest for a couple of weeks. We'd seen them, and we'd selected them from all of the applicants to get to the 50 that we started with in the fall. And then we trimmed that number farther to travel with 30 students through Ecuador for 11 weeks in January through April of 2016.
And for those of you who don't know Ecuador is a small country by some measures, but it is terrifically diverse. Not only does it contain the most diverse habitat on Earth, as far as we know, in the Amazon, one of the places that we visited, but it also has, the Altiplano, high in the Andes. It's got cloud forest. It's got an amazing diversity of habitats and creatures and cultures. And so anyway, it's a spectacular place. And to spend, and the Galapagos, of course, to spend 11 weeks touring with students that you know really well who are, because this was Evergreen, we were biologists, but we were teaching about paleoanthropology, we were teaching about evolutionary ecology, we were teaching about evolutionary dynamics.
And we did cultural history and modern cultural norms and expectations in Ecuador as well.
And so we got to basically use Ecuador as the test case for all of these things. We could go look at it. So anyway, this was happening the year before Evergreen came apart. Now we want you to see what Evergreen looked like when it was firing on all cylinders. So let's put up some photos. All right. Well, I'm going to set this image up, and then hopefully Zach will be able to put it on the screen for you. The image is a picture of 30 students plus Zach with a bus in kind of the distant background. And these students are experiencing something utterly remarkable. Now, what has just happened is these students have just encountered the headwaters of the Amazon. They have just crossed into the watershed that becomes hundreds of miles away, the Amazon River. And where they are standing, it is but a trickle. Behind them, you can see the first cecropia trees they've ever encountered. These will become a very common feature of our discussions because they're such an important feature of tropical forest. But in any case, they're up here in the clouds in this cold location watching, essentially the process that creates the Amazon at its very beginning. And they're excited. You can see that these are students that are happy to be having this experience. They didn't expect it. But they're excited by what they're able to actually walk up to and touch.
It's such an amazing picture. It really takes me back. And we've heard from two of the people in this picture in the last couple of days with regard to this being an anniversary that's coming up. And we've been in touch, of course, with another who we work with on a regular basis. So, three of the people in this photo we've been in touch with in the last week. And, probably another 10 of them we're in regular contact with.
So, in fact, for those of you who are watching and not just listening, the woman kneeling in the front row is Odette, who will come up here in a couple of other photos. She's a good friend of ours. We've seen her recently. But anyway, her story actually tells the story of what happened at Evergreen so well that... Anyway, I think we just can't avoid exploring it. So let's go a little further here. So this image is of Heather and Zach and Toby, although Zach is barely recognizable in this photo, and a student of ours who we've run into. This is Carnival. This is the night before Carnival, which is the night of the grandfathers. The night of the grandfathers. And the tradition in Ecuador basically is for people to run around like madmen, spraying each other with foam. And anyway, our students have taken to this, and they're participating, and we're participating. And this is a great cultural lesson. And, I don't know that the foam tradition is wonderful or absurd or whatever it might be, but it's the reality of what takes place in this beautiful colonial city in Ecuador. Mm-hmm. Here we are having run into a student who's obviously... fully integrated himself into this tradition. Yep. Let's see. Maybe the Hat Factory. Yep. All right. So here are our students.
This is a day trip from Cuenca.
A day trip out of Cuenca. These students are watching women make Panama hats in an all-female hat collective that exists in Ecuador. And so we saw the whole process of how they made hats. Again, Odette here is front and center. Let's see.
This is going to be Cajas, so another day trip. Another day trip from Cuenca.
So this is a very surprising habitat that we are hiking through. This is Cajas National Park. You can see these peaks, which are almost always enshrouded in clouds. It's ultra cold. Anyway, a really magical place. And I think we have a picture of... let's see.
Another Odette picture.
All right, so here's Odette discovering Cajas National Park. Now, I hate to do this because, in some sense, I don't want to sully Cajas National Park or the wonderful reality of Odette with the terrible thing that happened to her. In some sense, it's parallel to what happened to us. You know, we were teaching in a way that was extremely rewarding, and then something monstrous came for us. But I think I should read something. Odette did not intend for this to be public, but I did ask her if it was okay if I read part of what she wrote. I will try to adjust it so that it makes sense. So she's discussing.
When did she write this?
She sent it to me out of the blue this morning.
Oh, this is today.
Yeah,
Okay.
she was realizing that it was the third anniversary of May 23rd, and that's important to her for the same reason it's important to us.
Yep.
So, a year after she was here in Cajas National Park, she is discussing the meeting in which George Bridges, the president of the college, has ostensibly agreed to address the concerns that the students have advanced. And she says that some left the address with confidence and assurance, leaving the rest with even more confusion and questions. But as you know, there was no room for questions. These activists were acting as if they were bored. They wanted something to do. All in all, students were upset that they had failed at college and decided to get the institution to pay for their shortcomings. I was diligently on campus that week. This would be week 9 and 10. She said the museum got vandalized. Okay, this is the same thing you were referencing that Steve had discussed.
Yep.
The Cal's windows were broken and shattered. People were roaming around with bats. There were no police. Campus was covered in graffiti. Normal students, in quotes, would not make eye contact with me on campus. They were afraid of me. They were afraid of my skin color. I was followed and prevented from entering the Lab 1 building, surrounded by a group of activists who were screaming all sorts of nonsense, but were in fact shouting, I shouldn't be studying science. Their exact words were, a piece of shit for studying science. Crazy. Are people's lives so corrupt that they are going to actually take time to target and accost complete strangers? Do you know how much effort that takes? How exhausting it is? She says, I was able to leave the library, which was barricaded by the protesters, who were really rioters at that point. She says, I was able to leave the library solely based on the way I looked in comparison to the captors. I was confronted at Lab 1 for the same reason. The second resistance was displayed, proving myself not going along with the crowd. I was either deemed a lost soul, a traitor, or a white sympathizer. You're benefiting from white privilege, my captor said. I'll never forget that. By their own logic, so were they. One thing I will never understand is how people cannot think for themselves. No matter where you fall, you must be able to think. This is a college. There are supposed to be thousands of thinkers present. What happened to them? Where did they go?
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah.
That's the Odette I know.
It's Odette. And
I
so
had never heard, though. I mean, she and you and I have talked a lot, many, many, many hours in the 3 years since Evergreen blew up. And I'd never, the one thing in there I hadn't heard before was that other students who weren't part of the protests avoided her, were scared of her because of her color, because of her skin color. It's astounding.
it's the most upsetting feature of this whole thing because, I mean, I must tell you, I learned something about race from Odette, as I've mentioned elsewhere. I took Odette to be black, but in talking to her about it, and she was very open with us, her family is...
Her mother was Afro-Caribbean, and her father's European.
Dad is of European descent.
Yeah.
And the fact is, as one can easily imagine once somebody points you to it, in her case, she doesn't feel black or not black. These are the two sides of her family. And, one does not default to mother or father or one way of thinking or the other. The point is that's the nature of the way human beings are.
She's just an extraordinary human being who's a scientist and a ballerina and a writer and an artist and brilliant at phylogenetic trees and at field work. And she was actually one of the students who came to Evergreen entirely of her own volition. She could have gotten in nearly anywhere. She was an excellent student, and not because she was a follower or a sheep, but because she was just an excellent student who was creative and hardworking and analytically beyond competent. And she came to Evergreen because she loved the model. And so, she was not a misfit in any way arriving in our classroom. And boy, at this point, the point this picture was taken, she had been my student consistently for almost 2 full years, and yours for only 1/4 less than that.
Yeah.
I met her, as with so many of the students, including almost all of the ones who were in that boat accident with me later in the same trip, as they entered college for the first time.
Yeah.
Freshmen in college.
And so this highlights one of the things. So Odette was simultaneously a student of ours and a friend of ours.
Yeah.
And these two things were not in conflict. She put her trust in us for good reason, I think, and it paid off for her. But this did not mean that we couldn't also be friends. And so she shows up all kinds of places. Those of us who've been following us carefully will know of the terrible boat accident that you were in. Odette was in the boat accident with you, was badly injured as you were. The day before that boat accident, she and I had walked down the face of this crater together. The class had been looking at this volcanic crater, and we had spent, I don't know, half an hour or an hour involved in conversation. I don't even remember what it was, but I do remember how fun it was walking down this crater with her and remarking on the biology that was there and talking about lives. I think she was talking to me. She loves live theater, and she was talking to me about some of her favorites. But then also, she shows up on the day of absence. I did not have class. It was a Wednesday, and I did not have class scheduled. But I had said in the letter that became famous, I had said, you should expect to find me on campus, and I didn't want not to live up to it. So I went to campus, and I ran into Odette, and we went and had a conversation for an hour. And I later asked her if she had arranged to find me to keep me out of trouble. And she said, no, it hadn't even occurred to her. And in fact, we didn't even talk about day of absence. It wasn't,
of course.
It wasn't a worthwhile topic of conversation from our perspective.
Yeah. So do you want to, Zach, to take this down? You want to show a few more pictures before we move?
Let's move to a couple more pictures.
How about this one?
Yeah, let's look at this one. All right, this is a picture of students involved in a mud fight in the Napo River.
Oh, I love this one. And I love this moment.
So the Napo is a tributary of the Amazon. Yeah. And later in the trip, we will find ourselves in a different part of the Amazon in another tributary called the Shirapuno, a tributary of the Napo.
Yep.
But anyway, here these guys are...
they're having a mud fight.
They're having a mud fight.
In a tributary of the Amazon, in the Amazon basin, in Ecuador. And you know what they're learning? This is education. This is the picture when I wrote that New York Times op-ed on nature being risky, and that's why students and everyone need it. This is the picture that I hoped could accompany it. But it turns out that if you're writing about college students, that they have college students do the art for the piece. So it wasn't an option. But this qualifies as some of the highly educational work that these students were doing. And of course, they also did field work, and they took data and they did analysis, and they reported them out to us, often by candlelight while swatting at mosquitoes in remote places with, no doors or screens or running water. But this too, they're having fun and learning. Okay, what else do you have here?
Maybe that's... I guess... let's see.
Oh, what is this?
That's a picture of...
Oh, that's Cajas again.
Yeah, that's Cajas again. I guess if we go... there's one last picture of Cajas. This is interesting. It's Lucas leading a group of people. Lucas, who I also feel like could have gotten in anywhere, but...
oh, yeah, for sure.
Really appreciated the unusual model. And then maybe the last thing, that's a self-portrait that I took of you and me the night after the boat accident, in which you very nearly died, and I spent 45 minutes sure that you had. So anyway, I don't know what that picture is doing here, but it means something important to me, so I figured I'd include it.
Yeah. Okay, maybe we can go back to
Yeah.
non-photos now. All right. So you go for it.
Well, the thing about, if we can just, I hate to take advantage of what Odette has supplied us here, but what happened to Odette being confronted by other students accused of basically being a race traitor for studying science, this so encapsulates the confusion that was at the heart of the Evergreen riots and meltdown that I just think it makes sense to spend just a moment thinking about what it implies. Somebody without race on their mind at all has decided that she didn't know that she was science oriented until, she encountered you in that first program and saw that there was just all of this amazing power to understand that was potentially at her disposal, did brilliantly. And then here she is being confronted by violent thugs who are trying to shame her into abandoning what she's discovered that's so wonderful, rather than what should have happened, which is that the whole college should have, led people in the direction of ideas that actually empower you rather than turn you into monsters. And so something about it just strikes me as the confrontation between the civil rights movement's understanding of the objective and this new intersectional garbage that is its most dangerous foe.
So that's a good segue, I think. I wanted to share something from one of the faculty, the emeritus faculty, who stood up in defense of you and us and truth and reason beginning in January of 2017. And it totally unexpected. And neither of us had any knowledge of him except that we imagined that he might fall on the other side of this, but he very much did not. So just an excerpt from Alan Nasser, who in his sign-off to this email reminds his readers that he is in fact not white. He says, "I have been following the remarkable, truly remarkable posts on the alleged epidemic of racism rampant among Evergreen faculty." So this is in January of 2017. "Let's be clear," he writes, "that there are no traces whatever of racism at Evergreen is highly unlikely, given the unmistakable force of racism in American society. But what is alleged, by some very privileged people of color, I should add, must be thought by the complainants to be a virtual epidemic, given the sweeping and sometimes vitriolic nature of the complaints issued on this thread. There is in fact no such epidemic on this campus." Later in the same email, he says, "A small number of faculty and staff here have embarked upon a campaign and a series of posts that would look ludicrous and quasi-pathological to most decent readers outside of this campus. And the real white fragility here is to be found among the white folks dripping with guilt and liable to intimidation."
Yeah, I did not imagine that Alan was going to show up in our defense, but I must say it was so heartening. And, it goes back to the theme that we started with, which is the crisis reveals everyone's character.
That's exactly right.
And, for those of you who are potentially facing such things in the world, this is an important thing. You should expect it to happen, and you should expect people to disappoint you, and you should expect people to show up with strengths you didn't know they have, because both things happen. What you shouldn't do is assume that because somebody is decent enough on a day-to-day basis when there is no crisis, that they are not going to flee or turn on you just because they're a nice person. The fact is, cowardice is a very dangerous drug.
Yeah, it sure is. Now, you had mentioned some of the crazy happening behind the scenes that, for the most part, was not revealed to the world. I'd like to share just two examples of this. From February 15th, 2017, so when it was good and clear that this was going off the rails to us on the inside, but the rest of the world didn't know, a student by the name of Mike Penhaligon, I'm probably mispronouncing his name, writes, "Dear Bret, to be clear, this is to all staff and faculty, I think, and so some students were on this list because they were student employees. So he writes, Dear Bret, to be clear, as a sciences student, you and your racist colleagues are the reason I won't recruit future students, which incidentally was his job, to recruit future students. You and your racist colleagues are the reason I won't recruit future students. If the current reorganization that I support makes you uncomfortable, I have no question to lean in on supporting those plans. Thoughtfully, Mike Penhaligon.
Oh, that was thoughtful.
Oh, so thoughtful. And then May 27th, so 4 days into the riots, Stephen Flusty, who signs off as Professor of Fortune, I have no idea what that means, begins a May 27th email this way. Thank you, and he names a bunch of people, including Zoltan and Naima, who some viewers will be familiar with. And my apologies for snipping your words, to which I now add far too many of my own. I'm just including this as an example of the kind of language that critical theory produces in academics. So this is an academic so in the grievance studies and critical theory that he thinks this makes sense. I am merely an adjunct, a temp with little real status here, and am thus in a particularly vulnerable position. As such, I have remained silent in public. I have remained silent while supremacist evolutionary just-so stories, as Stephen Jay Gould rightly called them, with an entirely appropriate call-out to the flatulent poet laureate of white supremacy, Rudyard Kipling, have been promulgated. I have remained silent while privileged whinged and moaned interminably as it tried to usurp the status of a beleaguered minority. And I'm going to just skip some of this, it's ridiculous. And now propagandizing steps of the most thoughtfully self-absorbed sort have been taken that invoke outside violence down upon a great many of my students, my partner, and myself, all of us truly vulnerable persons at Evergreen and in the larger region beyond, on numerous axes of identity, plainly visible and otherwise.
That's marvelous.
It is so marvelous.
Is Professor of Fortune like Soldier of Fortune?
I think it's supposed to be, yes.
Does he know what that means?
I don't think so.
As a mercenary professor. I mean, that fits perfectly, actually.
Oh, wait, there's one more from him. Later, in the same email, he said, Thanks, Bret. Please be aware that this, like all similar communications received previously, and any that may be coming in future, are also being forwarded under separate cover to legal counsel.
Yeah.
Quaking in your boots yet?
Not quite.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's... So I was...
this is what caused us to look at each other over and over again and go, I can't believe that they keep on doubling down, that they keep on doing these ridiculous things, and isn't it a shame that the world will never know? As it turns out that the world did come to know, and yet still they kind of won.
Oh, they clearly won something.
They won the college, and it's failing, but amazing.
Well, look, I would love for people to get the full context of the marvelous thing that was going on at the same place that the terrible thing was going on and what that implies. It's a deep lesson, and it's a difficult one. I have to say, my favorite email of all, I can't find.
I know, I couldn't find it either.
My favorite email, and it may be Flusty, I'm not sure. But anyway, the idea was that he was describing a conflict, I think, during the riots. And he said, the important question here is not who's right here, but who's white here. And I thought, A, what does that mean? And B, it does? I mean, how... That's the important thing?
I mean, it just puts into such completely stark relief this dichotomy that Jonathan Haidt has pointed out many times, right? That you can maximize truth, that the searching for truth, or you can maximize the quest for social justice, but you cannot maximize both simultaneously. And that quote, not who's right, but who's white here, just is the perfect synopsis of the choice.
Well, it's almost like that was the secret behind the scenes thing that he wasn't supposed to reveal was really the core organizing principle of this thing.
Oh
like
my God.
that right and wrong has been replaced by white and not white. And it's like, at a college?
At a college.
You're going to, that idea isn't good enough for the brainstorming session when somebody then shoots it down. You've built a movement around this? Like, oh, God.
We've got, there's lots and lots from this one, but Naima Lowe posted to her Facebook page just before the canoe meeting, the famous canoe meeting, a proposed rule for the upcoming meeting. Now, it did not end up getting adopted, but she proposed this rule for the upcoming faculty meeting, for the upcoming canoe meeting.
So
Quote,
wait.
okay.
In fairness, this was, I'm pretty sure, tongue in cheek, but I do think why is the joke funny to her is the question. Anyway.
What she says is only appointed or approved whites can speak, and only when spoken to.
Yeah, I don't think that's a good rule.
You don't.
Does that surprise you?
Yeah, no, it doesn't. I mean, I could go on, but maybe this is the point is made. That inside the school, it was a pressure cooker for the last year, right? And there were many there, many students, some on staff, fewer on faculty, fewer on admin, although there were a few brave people on admin who were watching the thing and could not figure out how to stop it. Admin had some power, should have, but you were doing more than anyone. You were trying everything possible, and it was unstoppable. And they said so. In as many words, in as many ways, there began to be a cabal of first a couple and ultimately a good 10 or 14 faculty members who every time you wrote any email to the staff faculty thread, the all staff faculty thread, they would respond almost as a unit and just pile on and accuse you of all the things we've now become familiar with, you having been accused of, with, of course, no evidence, because there can be no evidence for something that isn't true.
Yeah, and the hard part to understand is that this energy existed on the campus, and not unique to Evergreen, but it was catalyzed. The nucleating event was the hiring of George Bridges, who, there's a debate amongst those of us who've followed the story closely about whether or not he is diabolical or just inept. And really the answer is, well, he's clearly inept, but that's not, you can be both. And what he did was he partnered with this madness in order to advance his own agenda. And, it unleashed this on the campus, which I don't think he expected, but...
Les Perce, the previous president, had been holding it at bay. And frankly, Les Perce, because he happened to be a black man, could more easily dismiss out of hand without giving any time to these people at all, any such complaints that came his way. I presume he was doing it. We basically never saw it until he stepped down and we got Bridges.
Well, we did see it, and it's one of the
Rarely,
pieces
though.
of video. No, not during his tenure.
Oh, yes.
But famously, as one of the main buildings on the campus was remodeled and then renamed in his honor, he came back from retirement for the dedication. And the very same people who show up again and again and again in the protests of you and me,
The student activists,
those same students confronted him. And this is the place where they reveal, he invokes Martin Luther King. He reasons with them and he says, look, I'm not deaf to your concerns, but there's a right way and there's a right objective, and what you all are doing is dangerous to this. And they shut him down, and he invokes Martin Luther King, and one of the protesters says, yes, but Dr. King is dead, as if that's an indictment of what he advocated. But anyway, so yes, ultimately, even Les Perce, frankly,
can't make headway against them. On the other hand, he can't make headway against them coming back to campus for an afternoon, having ceded power, having stepped down after a long tenure 18 months or so before. So I don't think that that group of activists could have done that in the middle of Les Perce's term as president.
No, I can't imagine that they would have, nor would he have done any of the foolish things that George did that empowered the mob so that they had such great leverage.
So where do we point our fingers? Right? There are many types of players and there are many individual players, and some of them are awful, but most of them aren't simply awful. Right? There's admin level George Bridges being the most famous. There's faculty and staff, and there's students. And as it happened, because the video that went viral, that the students themselves took and posted, and then someone unknown to us took that video off of someone's Facebook page or something and put it on YouTube, it was easy to point a finger at the students and say they're entitled, they're ridiculous, they belong in this is Maoist, and they're at the base of this. Neither you nor I find them to be central in the story, actually, the activist students.
Right. I mean, I think one of them clearly is.
Yeah.
But this actually goes to a discussion I've been having on a number of fronts with a number of different people, where I hear people give advice, and the advice is of this nature. You will be better if you imagine that everyone is acting in good faith. And my feeling about this is when people, even if somebody is advocating something terrible, very often they don't understand that that's what they're doing, and assuming that they are acting in good faith relative to what they internally believe actually works. It's helpful. But if you just make this a universal approach, you are signing up to make yourself vulnerable to every truly bad actor. And these truly bad actors exist, not in large numbers, in small numbers, but they do prey on those who use a heuristic like that and make themselves incapable of fending off an attack. And so I think one of the things that I believe happened is that a place like Evergreen accumulates people who are basically cowards. I mean, academia in general seems to, but Evergreen maybe even worse. And an assumption like that is basically a neon sign advertising for people who are really just in it for themselves. And, I saw something. Benjamin Boyce put up an interview that he had done with a student of mine who was a student at the time the protests broke out. Actually, Zach, could you put up the video of George talking and then put up the...
Maybe it depends if it works.
All right, we will see if this
It's
works.
not working. I have no idea.
It's not working. That's unfortunate. So in any case, this is a student of mine who says that she had worked as a waitress at a restaurant near the college, and that George would come in frequently and she would end up serving him. And she describes that there is a moment at which he realizes that he has met her before and that she is an Evergreen student. And she describes that he puts on this smile and he asks her how her studies are going, and he inquires about whether or not she is liking Evergreen. And her comment is, I just had the sense that that is the moment at which he decided to care, to seem like he gave a damn.
This reminds me of so many of our former colleagues. Probably you were going someplace else with this, but I was marveling reading through some of the past emails at the kind of thinking that everyone now is sort of immersed in, like, believe all women, right, with the Me Too movement. But back in the year leading up to the Evergreen protests, we had a lot of believe all students and believe all people of color. And it's the same horrifying, gameable idea that any demographic should be inherently believable because any demographic is inherently truth-seeking and lovely in every regard is obviously simply going to be false. But
the audio just messed up in another way. It's now doing that stuttery thing that we've both seen before.
What are you telling me, Zach?
I don't know. I mean, people can hear you. You should continue, but there's a million problems that weren't there before, and that's one of them.
All right, folks, here's what we're going to do. We are going to continue to forge ahead. We are hearing in the chat that people are having trouble with the audio. If it becomes intolerable, come back when we've uploaded the video. We're recording it locally so we can do a fine version and put it up quickly. We apologize for this. It is downstream of us. That much we know.
All right, that's unfortunate. So I was talking about this believe all students logic that was showing up a lot in conversations and emails in the 2016-2017 academic year. And I will say that I tended to see this from exactly the people who, will talk about, we need to be student-centered and we need to be student-focused. And almost always, when I knew anything about these faculty, and in some cases I had taught with some of them, I know that as soon as the doors were closed and there wasn't any possibility that students were listening in, these were exactly the faculty who were dehumanizing students, refusing to learn their names, much less anything about them. And this is one of the things that was absolutely possible and necessary to use Evergreen in the maximally best way possible, which was to take the opportunity of having a full-time program for 10 weeks or 20 weeks or 30 weeks, and not just learn everyone's names within a couple of days, obviously, but learn something about them so that you actually had an ongoing sense of who they were as people. They're not brains in jars. And I developed this rubric late in the game at Evergreen at the point that I had grown quite tired of most of our colleagues precisely because of this. And said, God, there should be just I have a low bar for what it should take to be a successful faculty at Evergreen. And it's two things. You should actually believe in the fundamental humanity of your students, and you should have something real that that you're capable of communicating. And so many faculty failed one or both of those rubrics. And this thing that you say about your student who was waiting tables at a place where George Bridges came in, that she saw the mask go up.
Yeah.
Which means the mask sometimes comes down. And this is certainly the sense that we had of him throughout, that he was not who he appeared, that, hapless
that the bow tie
or evil
was a
genius, who knows, but, some kind of combination of the two, and certainly the evil genius trope would use haplessness as a thing to hide behind.
Yeah. The irony, of course, though, is that many of the people who were leading the charge would tell you that the enemy was old white men. And from the outside, it really looks to me like the college, they've now announced that George will retire at the end of his contract. They're going to give him the right to teach at the college after he's retired, which is very unusual. The college is now selling a false story that it's the pandemic that has caused the failure, and before that they were selling the false story that the decline in enrollment was going before Bridges arrived. And of course, it's not that there wasn't an enrollment issue, but it's quite obvious from the graph that there's a precipitous catastrophe surrounding George and his plan for the place. And somehow, as he's brought the place to its knees, and they can't bear to have a conversation with him in which they say, actually, George, you've done a rotten job. Don't let the doorknob hit you on the way out.
No, they're still talking about him having used wisdom throughout difficult times.
Yes, they're praising the man. And so they've liquidated a college. And what did that college do? That college served underserved people. Who did they liquidate it for? So as not to embarrass George Bridges? What kind of upside-down world are we living in? How did they not notice that they were, in some sense, doing exactly the thing that they declared the world was guilty of?
That's right.
All right.
It's an hour-ish.
It's an hour-ish.
A little over an hour, yeah.
There's a ton more that we can talk about, of course. We were planning to take a break at some point and take Super Chat questions, but only those relating to Evergreen in the second hour, and to choose as we see fit. We may see one or two that we end up talking about for the entire time, or we may go through many of them. I feel like there's so much more to say. Oh, let me just say this. So the thing about Crisis revealing everyone's character.
Yeah.
We've talked a little bit about the expected places where we found support, mostly in students, and a little bit also about the unexpected, including from Alan Nasser. And let me just say one more of those and then mention some previously unknown to us. That the public records officer at the college, I had done a Freedom of Information Act request after there was an assault on campus by protesters of a student which Stacey Brown, who we heard from today, who was the police chief at the time, who was amazing. She had told me about this and said, you need to do a FOIA request. And then someone there was blocking access for a long time. And Wendy Morris got it to me, and she sent me a CD and included a handwritten note, notably, that could not be tracked via other FOIA requests, in which she said that she really hoped that we were doing well and that she was so sorry for what we were going through and that we were all part of a community. This is from a staff person who we had never met, who actually, it turns out, is a woman of color, a Black woman, who took time out and, frankly, probably some risk to make a point of reaching out. And there were many emails like that from people as well, people we'd never heard from before, never heard of before. But let me just say that, of course, as you know, the reason we can do this now and have an audience is in part because so many people that we had not previously known but were known to the world reached out to us right away. Nicholas Christakis, Jonathan Haidt, Jerry Coyne, Michael Shermer. You went on Dave Rubin and Tucker Carlson and Sam Harris and Joe Rogan and and more and more and more and more, right?
Yeah.
And all of those people and many more that I'm forgetting to list here and wouldn't have time to. Bob Woodson. One of the original civil rights leaders who actually wanted to come and get some of the original civil rights leaders with him and come to campus and march on campus with us during the protests. And we were ready to say yes, and then it descended into actual violence.
Well, no, it was actually, yes, it descended into that. He was still ready to go. The problem was it was week 10, and so there was no way to get him here in time. The students were about to
being
scatter
the last
week of the quarter, so
yeah.
people were going to scatter to the winds.
Yeah. So let me just end with one more. This is someone we don't know, we never met, who wrote to the all staff faculty email, and I'll just read the email. He says, "Dear Mr. Bridges and Evergreen faculty and staff, I am one of Evergreen's earlier graduates. I entered as a junior the day the college's doors opened and graduated in 1973. I later got my doctorate in zoology at UC Davis. I remain in close contact with Dr. Steve Herman and many of his students. I am very proud to be a gooey duck," that's the mascot of Evergreen, "especially as a product of the tremendous tradition of field biology that Dr. Herman and other faculty have maintained over the years, a tradition virtually unique in the nation. Thus it is with a sense of shame that I witnessed the treatment of Bret Weinstein by a mob of closed-minded students who seem to mistake the purpose of a liberal arts education. You, sir, must take a more forceful role in support of Dr. Weinstein. I imagine I am one of many thousands of Gooey Duck alums waiting anxiously to see that Dr. Weinstein keeps his job. Further, I suspect that many other alums, like I, question the wisdom of the college's new equality of outcome agenda described in Dr. Weinstein's Wall Street Journal commentary. In closing, please get a grip, people. This is my college you're messing with. Sincerely, David F. Whitaker, class of 1973.
Class of 73. So
Yeah.
that's like...
It's like the second year that it was up and running.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Amazing.
And, you ended up receiving thousands of emails, and I went through most of them. And there were, I think, 2 really heinous death threat level anti-Semitic things and a couple of other mildly negative things. And otherwise, it was from all demographics, from all parts of the world, ages, sex, races, everything, educational level, career, interests, political spectrum, to say thank you and please keep fighting the good fight.
Yeah, it was like 1,000 to 1.
Yeah.
It was amazing. All right. Shall we take a break and then come back and answer some questions?
Let's do it.
All right. Sorry for the technical difficulties. It's downstream of us. I wish we are trying to switch ISPs in an effort to get away from this. But anyway, for now, it is what it is. We will see you in a few minutes. The link to the next stream will be in the description of this one. Like, subscribe, notify, comment, and we'll see you shortly.